Father Hugh, in this fourth episode of our series on 5 things every Catholic should know about the papacy, we want to delineate the limits of the papacy and speak about more precisely how far it extends, and where it does not extend. Mm-hmm. And of course, in the last episode, we spoke about some of the errors that people in their judgment, lay faithful, especially in their judgment, might have with respect to the person of the Holy Father, the reigning pontiff. In this conversation, this part of our conversation, we want to speak about how people might think erroneously and how they can think correctly about the limits of this authority that the Pope has. Yeah. What is it?
It's very good, but a little preliminary note regarding the person of the Pope, that we have to keep in mind that the ordinary laws of charity bind us in our evaluations and words about the Holy Father that would also bind us regarding anybody else. Mm-hmm. And so it's wrong to judge people's motives and to criticize them without full understanding. And all the more when it's a person in a high position of authority who deserves our religious respect. Mm-hmm. And so the problem is with the Holy Father in particular is that we're allowed a great deal of freedom in discussing political figures. In our system, more leeway than you would normally think could be given to be critical or skeptical or about a particular person or their ideas. But we have to keep in mind we should not adopt that political approach to the Pope and try to avoid comments about his personality or his position that are not well founded, because we have to have respect for his office above else. But that's just an important aspect of
very important. Yes,
maintaining that. So
yeah, I think that's a good proviso. Yeah. But more specifically about what his function is.
But his function is very important to say that not just the limits of the papacy, but the limits in the sense of what defines
yes,
his
exactly.
office.
Limits in that sense. What defines it?
What defines the office?
The boundaries around it.
And that will tell you what the limits might be.
Okay.
And that's, of course, it's not bad to pose it. What are the limits? Because we've already posited the Pope as someone that has universal and immediate jurisdiction over everybody. And you have the quote like from Innocent the Third or whatever. It's necessary for the salvation of every human creature to be subject to the Roman Pontiff. Well, that's a pretty big,
that's pretty broad,
broad claim. Yes. So Boniface VIII and all of that. But so it is important to consider that. But the fact is that the Pope's principal duty, of course, is to be the head of the College of Bishops, who have the immediate care of the faithful most of the time. And then, but then because he has this universal role with the bishops who are teachers in their own diocese, he has a universal teaching office for the entire church. And so the office of teaching in a universal manner, addressing the entire church, he alone has the charism, established charism of universal magisterium, universal teaching. And so that's a very important aspect of the nature of the papal office. Okay. And that's where he has to be treated with the greatest respect. Whatever his judgments regarding the appointments of persons or historical developments or whatever are, but what the Pope teaches is something where we have to go sit up and listen.
Right, and that when you're speaking very precisely there, aren't you, Father Hugh, of when he teaches in the universal in his role as the teacher of the universal magisterium in the context of the universal magisterium, that doesn't mean anything he just happens to say on this or that interview.
Right.
He's teaching precisely in his function as
universal teacher.
Yes.
And that, of course, that doesn't mean either that we're speaking only of the cases where he intends to speak infallibly or, in an irrevocable or definitive way. That's especially solemn, where he has the charism due to the definition of the First Vatican Council of infallibility when he defines teaching and faith and morals as revealed by God. And
such as Our Lady's Assumption to Heaven, bodily Assumption, or the Immaculate Conception.
But rather the universal magisterium, which is not extraordinary as our dogmatic definitions, but rather the ordinary but universal magisterium, which also is indefectible. It can't fail either. And things can be regarded as infallibly and certainly so in virtue of the universal magisterium. An example would be the nature and ends of marriage. They've been reiterated so many times that there is no way on earth that the Church could, without eviscerating her nature, teach something different.
Then the fact that marriage is the union of one man and one woman
for the procreation of children
and for the good of the
and
spouses.
union of the spouses,
Right.
and the procreation of children for the worship of God according to the rite of the Christian religion, not just having lots of kids,
Right.
but having children to form them to be worshipers of God. That's something that can't be changed, right. and it's very interesting that the worst forms of dissent, or the most entrenched, or the ones that get the most attention in the media, are precisely that dissent which regards the nature and ends of marriage.
That's right.
That's why Sister Lucia of Fatima said that will be the last big battle is over the nature of marriage. You know, and we can see it.
It occurs to me, Father Hugh, that there's the idea that in his office that we've just been speaking about as teacher in this way, the Pope primarily is defending and rearticulating, protecting the deposit of the faith. Mm-hmm. How does that touch on, because for example, like you give the example of marriage, that's part of the deposit of the faith. It touches on practically the essence of what it means to be a Catholic Christian and what is the church. Right. And that's something that the Pope has to defend in his role as universal teacher. Where does the development of doctrine factor into this? Is the Pope part of the development of doctrine? Because it seems like that's a place where people can be very confused. Well, he can just sort of invent new doctrine because he's a universal teacher.
No, the Pope is not the president of the Mormon Church, able to create new doctrines or to replace old ones with new ones. You know, the even development of doctrine is not itself a doctrine of the Catholic faith. Right? It's a theological opinion formulated in various ways. Some felicitous and good formulations, and others questionable ones. And of course, it became particularly popular because of the Newman's, St. John Henry Newman's development of Christian doctrine, which he wrote as a Protestant, and which even the Holy Father didn't want to be reproduced in a Catholic form, but just to continue to be published in its original Protestant form, because the Pope viewed it as an example of how a Protestant mind could have access and openness to the fullness of Catholic truth by his study of history, not because they were approving of some new organ of doctrine,
some Hegelian kind of
that kind of shows you how it can be defined or clarified by historical development.
Marching in through this progress of thought through history.
And I think that actually that to view doctrine as developing that in that way would be false. I think the development of doctrine is more like the growth of a venerable tree in a forest, and its branches go out and its roots go down, and that is in accordance with the circumstances of their growth. What little rock is in the way, where the water can be found,
where the sunlight can be found,
all that. And so it's more an historical development based upon the conditions of the time. And so, of course, it gives to doctrine a certain contour, but it doesn't make it essentially different from what it always has been, because the tree's always been a tree, and it was always going to grow into.
It's always that tree,
right? Exactly. And so it's important not to view it as though there's some kind of free ability to direct the progress of doctrinal understanding. The popes can attempt to do that by favoring certain schools of thought rather than others. For example, the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas and his perspective and way of doing theology, as they say nowadays, doing theology, theologizing, that has been given absolutely a favored status by the Church's teaching office. So there's an example there. But even that is not absolutely of the essence, because the teaching and the deposit of faith, as we would call it, precedes all of that.
There's a common admired priest friend of ours, not personal friend, who's now alas long dead, or several years dead, Father John Hunnick. He had this wonderful example I remember from many years ago in speaking about this discussion of the Pope as the defender of the faith, the protector of the deposit of the faith, versus some erroneous idea of him as a developer of doctrine. He said, he had this wonderful image. He said that the Pope is really like a workman standing at the edge of a cliff in a vest, brightly colored vest, holding a sign saying, "Stop, go no further, you're going to go off a cliff." Basically, as theology happens, as theologians discuss and opine and pray and work, the Pope is in his office is saying, if you go further, you're going to no longer be in the fold, or your doctrine will be no longer part of the deposit of the faith. So he's kind of a defender in that sense, not someone who's saying, what new ideas can we come up with to approach whatever contemporary question we're seeking.
Yes, what I would add to that, the Pope not only says no this far, no further, but then he also suggests the right path. Indicates the right path in order to stay within the lines of proper understanding. That's Beautiful. Very important because it's a positive role, not simply
not just a defensive
ones.
Yes.
Hunnick, I had an exchange with him, an email exchange, because he, as some people do, shockingly now, but they haven't been properly instructed, interpreted the virginity of Our Lady as simply being that as virginitas in conceiving, her virginity in conceiving the Lord, but not seeing the necessity of her being a virgin and bearing him. So his perpetual virginity, she never had relations with a man, and our Lord was conceived without natural intercourse. But he didn't see the importance of our Lord being born with the preservation of her physical intactness. And I tempted to correct him on that point, but let's just say I was given a very dismissive answer.
He sees the truth of that doctrine.
Yes,
clearly,
he does now.
As he looks on the face of
Claro intuitu, he sees
yes.
it. Yeah,
he's a wonderful person.
And I attempted to, but that is something, and that's just because, of course, the miracle of miracles is the incarnation of the Son of God of the Virgin Mary. And even though Our Lady knew that she had not had relations with a man, that's what she told the angel, still she also, because of the due order necessary for things, had to witness a miracle that attested to the certainty of what she'd experienced.
Mm-hmm. And she was the only one who could have witnessed that miracle.
Only one. That he came from her body without physically
compromising
or physically violating her and removing the maidenhead. So that's a very important point, because that's how miracles work. That's why our Lord rose from the dead to testify to the efficacy of the redemption wrought on the cross. And so also he is born of a Virgin Mother who is the witness, the one witness to that fact. And so it's
a good example of there right there is a piece of the a factor of the deposit of the faith, which is important for the church to continue to teach and to uphold and not to. Right.
And unfortunately, it hasn't been emphasized enough in modern times, even but even Pope John Paul II, he did reiterate the virginitas in partu, the virginity in childbearing, on a couple of occasions.
Yes,
very
thanks be to
clearly.
God. Just to wrap up this episode of our wonderful conversation about the papacy, it's been a great joy to speak about all these contours, and it's really, I'm finding it fascinating. I hope
it's good to bring it down to a point of doctrine too.
Yes, like that. I think that in this episode we wanted to be clear what the office of the papacy does with respect to doctrine and how the faithful can think about that. So we're not looking as lay faithful or as any faithful Catholic to what is the newest thing that the Pope can teach us about whatever. That's not how it works.
Right.
He's not inventing doctrine, but how is he showing us that image of the tree? I think growing roots and growing branches is a beautiful example to find its way. How does our church continue? How does the church and our life as Catholics continue to find its way through time until Christ comes again in glory? Yeah. And the Pope is helping to guide that, but not to invent it.
Not to invent it, right? Exactly.
Because it comes from the deposit of the faith is something that comes to us by divine revelation,
right?
From the Scriptures,
right? But it can only be perceived in the historical form in which it's presented to us, right. And so it'll always come to us in the form of a definition of a doctrine from one of the ecumenical councils or of the popes. Those things are necessary because that's the organ of transmission.
Great. Yeah. Good. So I think, Father Hugh, we can conclude in our next episode, which is the last episode of the series, with just some of the highlights of great pontificates reaching back through not all of time, but some of time.
Okay.
Great.